Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am your host, Steve Bisson. I'm an author and mental health counselor. Are you curious about therapy? Do you feel there is a lot of mystery about therapy? Do you wonder what your therapist is doing and why? The goal of this podcast is to make therapy and psychology accessible to all by using real language and straight-to-the-point discussions. This podcast wants to remind you to take care of your mental health, just like you would your physical health. Therapy should not be intimidating. It should be a great way to better health. I will demystify what happens in counseling, discuss topics related to mental health, and discussions you can have with your therapist. I also want to introduce psychology in everyday life, as I feel most of our lives are enmeshed in psychology. I want to introduce the subtle and not so subtle ways psychology plays a factor in our lives. It will be my own mix of thoughts as well as special guests. So join me on this discovery of therapy and psychology. Hi, and welcome to episode 41 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am Steve Bisson. If you haven't listened to episode 40, I urge you to do so. Probably one of the hardest podcasts I've had to do in a good way. Obviously, we want to be able to talk about the hard stuff, but we talked to Sergeant J. Ball and Caitlin Deehee about how the issues in Ukraine and Russia have affected people who are first responders, who have served in the military, and current people who are going to serve or are still enrolled to serve. And it was just a great conversation, so I hope you get back to it. But episode 41 is with Rachael Chatham. Rachael Chatham is someone I met through an online kind of forum because I had asked if anyone wanted to talk about their experience in therapy. So Rachael Chatham has been a licensed clinical mental health counselor in private practice in Asheville, North Carolina for the past 10 years. She's a certified Buddhist psychologist, trauma, stress, and schema therapy, and she integrates experimental work with traditional talk therapy in her work with individuals. Rachael works with people struggling in their relationship with themselves and others and finds her work with others very deeply meaningful and fulfilling. When she's not practicing psychotherapy, she can be found writing, reading, cooking, walking, or dreaming. So yes, I'm looking forward to talking about so many things there. Someone who practices Buddhism. I have written a book, obviously, so I hope we can get to some of that stuff. But here is the interview. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 41 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. Very excited. You know, it's interesting. You find guests in very different ways, and Rachael Chatham is someone that responded to something that I asked on, I believe it was LinkedIn, and I asked about a specific question, which we will get to. But Rachael was not only very generous with her time today, but she was also very generous with some explanations, what I truly, truly appreciate. And just like any interviews where I don't know someone, some of these questions will be genuine because I don't know. So, Rachael, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I'm excited to be here with you.
Well, Rachael, you know, the first thing I would like to know, and really it's a genuine question, but I think the audience also would want to know, is tell me a little bit about yourself.
So, I am a psychotherapist in Asheville, North Carolina, and I have been in private practice here for about 10 years. I would say that I specialize in depth therapy. I use a very integrative, holistic style. Most recently, I've started doing a lot of schema therapy. I got certified in schema therapy over the past year. I am also certified in Buddhist psychology. I'm a certified yoga teacher. So, when applicable, I bring some of that in. So, I have quite a few different kind of folks that I like to work with. Largely, I like working with history of relational trauma. I would say that's kind of my main thing. Long-term patterns that people find themselves stuck in and kind of breaking that cycle with them. I do a lot of parts work as well.
I just have like 27 different questions based on that answer alone. So I'm going to try not to get too much off the subject. One of the things that we were talking pre-interview is that I live now in Massachusetts, but you are originally born here, as I
I
understand.
am. I am indeed. I was born in Western Mass in a little city called Pittsfield. And I have nothing but really fond memories. But my family relocated to Florida when I was around 7 or 8. So most of my formative years through my mid 20s, all in South Florida.
And let's give a shout out to what part of Florida?
I am from Palm Beach County, so I grew up mostly in Boca.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. Well, I have a lot of therapist friends down in Florida also. So that's why I want to like give the shout out.
Yeah.
So Angela, if you're hearing me, that's why I did that. I did that for you. But yeah, no, I just thought it's interesting because you moved out of here. I moved in here. I mean, that's just the circle of life, if you ask me.
Indeed.
So someone doesn't wake up one day and say, all right, I'm going to have a private practice and I'm going to talk about relationship trauma and do Buddhist psychology. I mean, no one, if you woke up that way that one day, we are very interested in that story. But how do we get to that journey in life?
Well, I think, honestly, more and more I'm thinking about the answer to this question, just as I'm in my own process of doing some writing. And I know you mentioned you've also written a book, but I have to say, if I'm being totally honest here, I think a lot of us come to this work from our own early childhood conditioning within our families of origin, where we learn to be really sensitive, we learn to be really perceptive, we learn to take care of other people. We become really good at that. And I think for a lot of us, when we're at that point of choosing career and looking at our natural strengths, we tend to have some of that stuff already pretty well refined. So I think that's been a part of it for me, at least, just kind of growing up and
So being sensitive to others or being sensitive
Mhm.
because of your own family slash friends slash neighborhood process.
Yes. Yes, and I've always been fascinated by the human condition and human behavior and why do we do the things we do and why do we do them repeatedly, sort of to no avail. I've just always been fascinated by it and the concept of suffering, and what do we do with the suffering that we experience, which is part of the Buddhist psychology influence too.
You're just going to keep on tempting me on that one. I was going to say it's because of your desire, but anyway, what's funny is that I always ask that question to everyone because I always want to know where people got where they're at in their process. And my joke answer is when I was 16, I did a test and one of them came up as psychotherapist. And I said, wait a minute, people are going to talk to me about their problems and I'm going to get paid. That sounds like a sweet deal. But, ultimately, I know this is your interview, but, the real true story is, and it's in my book, it's my best friend died in a fire when I was 12. And
Mm.
that's really how my journey started after a little bit of issues for until I woke up that the loss of my friend is what caused me to have those issues when I was 13, 14, 15. So we all
Mm.
have a story like that, I guess. And yeah, I haven't repeated that one yet. I'm happy I haven't. But maybe it's a good place to start off with a little bit of so many things I want to talk about. But
Trauma is what brought you to this work, right? Which is exactly, I think, the thing for so many of us.
and I think that you're right, with the trauma, the relationship issues, the other stuff that comes with that. It's part of our work. I guess I definitely want to talk about trauma a little later on, and I definitely want to talk about Buddhism and like I said pre-interview, you've tempted me twice. It's hard for someone who follows Buddhist principles to not really bite into that, but I'm resisting temptation at this point because I don't want to desire anything, so I suffer. I guess what the reason why is that I really, you talk about how we get here, and because of our own journey,
Mhm.
how do we get someone to start thinking about their journey into therapy? Because, my experience anyway to this day is that a lot of people still struggle with, I need help. I need to possibly talk to someone. As a good friend of mine says, you can't solve a problem that the same mind created.
Yeah.
So, how do we talk to people about getting there?
As far as getting people to be willing to get into therapy who would benefit from it.
Right. Because I think while the pandemic has for 2 years has really opened up some stuff. I still
Mhm.
think there's a significant amount of resistance that I can take care of my own self, that bravado, for a lack of a better word.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I guess the word that comes to mind for me is just normalize. Keep normalizing that, therapy, there is still this stigma that therapy is for psychotic, crazy people. And where I live, luckily, that's not the case. But I know that I'm in a little tiny blue dot in the midst of a lot of red around. And people in the city that I'm in tend to really want to do the whole self improvement healing thing. But there are many places that are not like that at all. And so I think that while right now we're in a unique period in history where psychotherapy is more normalized than it has ever been before, watching therapy television commercials and, having it be so accessible where it's online therapy or telephone therapy or of course good old fashioned in-person therapy, I think accessibility is going to continue to be a key, and I think normalizing it. And I think the more people that are kind of like out and proud about the fact they're in therapy, that sort of it helps the profession, because for a child to say to their parent or their uncle, hey, I'm in therapy and here's what I find is helpful about it, is just kind of like helping to provide that education for people who might still be caught in that really stigmatizing view of what this work really is and can be.
And I think that you hit a few good points there. One of my favorite things is when I get my most resistant clients who come in and now they tell me, like, I sit at a table and I tell them, my therapist said, and I'm always a proud moment because I knew the resistance that started with and where they've developed that. So really lifting the stigma by showing your own treatment. And it's also kind of like, we do have blue dots, we have red dots, but I also think that there's gender differences,
Mm-hmm.
there's racial differences. And, I don't want to be, I want to solve every world problem, but I know I won't. I think do you think that that's also something that plays a factor in breaking down the stigma, is to kind of like reach out to these maybe different groups that may not be willing to reach out because it is tough in certain circumstances?
I do. And I like what you started out by saying, like, I don't know that I can fix every problem that exists around this issue. But I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think there are gender differences. I think there's probably differences in terms of race and culture and what people are taught and believe in different cultures about the importance or the efficacy of psychotherapy. I think those are all, big bridges to close the gap on.
And I think that it's also reaching out to the group. You reach out to most groups, you can increase your awareness and lift the stigma. And I hope that one day, my goal is that Massachusetts is apparently voting on this, knock on wood, once a year, you get a mental health visit for free.
Wow.
And I'm hoping that this is not only national, but being a Canadian, also international and Europe. I don't care, the whole world, frankly. But I think that that's the stuff that I always kind of remember is like, how I try to lift the stigma is that you go see your doctor when you're feeling fine once a year and you're not, oh my God, why do I have to see a doctor and then feel stigmatized? You just go in. So maybe this is a way to lift the stigma. And I really hope that people start buying into that too, because yes, there is people who have psychosis and have to go to treatment. And Jane and John Doe that I know are not people that you would ever point out and go, they need therapy. And I think that from my perspective, I'm in therapy. Well, not anymore, but got to find a new therapist and good luck with that. I don't know if that's the same thing in North Carolina,
Yep. Times are tough.
but I think that getting to therapy is never going to be something I have no problem talking about my own therapy. And there's a little bit of like the stuff that we kind of pre-interview again talked is that you talked a little bit about yourself being in therapy. And it's interesting because I always wonder, how does that inform your work as a therapist nowadays?
Yeah, so much so. And I can't speak highly enough of the therapist who does their own work, because I think that there are some huge potential blind spots for folks who want to be in the therapist chair but are unwilling to be in the client chair. So I think it's incredibly important. I started my own therapy. There's a couple of experiences I can kind of tell you about, but I've done therapy several different times, mostly in my 20s, so a little while ago now.
I thought you were 25.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I'm just a scat older than that. But in my early 20s, I had had a really terrible kind of a relationship trauma. So going back to that, with a boyfriend who I was dating. Just a relationship went really south. And I was personally lost. You know, you asked, how did I get into this world of psychology and therapy too? This was the pivotal time where I sort of had to declare a major and figure out what direction I was going to take. And I was just frozen scared, had no idea, didn't want to make the wrong choice, kind of didn't want to make any choice for fear that it would be the wrong one. And I ended up going to see a therapist at that time who essentially, I think I just really needed someone to talk to.
Right.
And she did this really wonderful thing for me. I didn't see her for very long, just a few sessions, really. But in the course of my relaying my relationship trauma with her, I was in tears and just crying and crying. And I think I probably had my hands over my eyes also. There was so much shame involved in what I had experienced. And I remember at one point I took my hands down and I looked over at her and she was also crying. And it sort of like it hit me in this really intense way that what I'm describing and what I'm feeling is enough to elicit tears in someone else. Wow, this must be like really real. This must have been like really bad. And it wasn't just that I was feeling sorry for myself. It's that, oh, this is like a really sad story. So that for me was one of those pivotal moments in my life when I saw that in her. It kind of made me think like, gosh, I feel stuff really deeply. You know, could I do work like this? And, you know, that was a really big positive experience. And even, you know, to this day, I make it a point that if I'm with a client and they're sharing with me a really sad story, or they're emoting in such a way that it is just evocative, I will shed a tear with them. I'm very cautious. I should disclaim this. I'm very cautious not to sort of overwhelm and kind of take over the session with anything I might be feeling,
Right.
but I'll sort of shed a tear with them, let them know, hey, wow, like this is crazy. The story you're telling me is an unbelievable tragedy. And in the hopes, you know, that they can feel empathized with, that they can really feel felt in that because it was so monumental for me.
And just a reminder of listening to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. You're sitting with Steve Bisa, Rachel Chatham. We're talking about something very important. I love what you said in regards to the therapist crying with you. And there is a professional way of doing so. If you take over the crying and make it about you, that's one thing. But I have zero shame to say that this has happened to me listening to my clients' stories. I make sure that I don't take over the session, and there is a way to ethically do that. What if, and I'm challenging you, I know the answer, I kind of talked about it, but what if someone says, well, that means you can't separate yourself from your clients, therefore you're not professional? What would you say to someone who says
I would probably start with the word ouch, which is
that?
which is a favorite of mine. I would beg to differ. You know, I think I'm very capable of separating myself professionally. And actually, I think I keep pretty good boundaries, which is another thing that I feel like I've learned from my experiences with clinicians who have not had as strong a boundaries. So I don't think it's a boundary issue. I don't think it's a professionalism issue. I think it's a human issue. And I think that when you are with someone who is suffering profoundly, I feel like it's a part of just, I mean, I'm a HSP, I'm highly sensitive, I'm an empath, right? All the things. For me, not to feel with them would be totally inauthentic. And again, I think that there is something about that is healing, just to see someone else feeling with you.
And I agree. And I agree wholeheartedly. I wouldn't say ouch. I would say, first of all, I don't care. Number two, but if you need a explanation, I would say similar things to you. And I would also add that clients need to feel that their suffering's real because as human beings, do you know a lot of people, more of a rhetorical question, that really validate their hard situations? They really just like, oh, I'm a wimp. I can't handle my own stuff. And, or why am I crying still and all that. So there is a validation when that someone else does that. And you talked about boundaries. I think it has to do with boundaries. And I think the misconception of boundaries is they have to be rigid or they're bad. And I tell people, no, there's three types of boundaries. There's a rigid boundary, there is a flexible boundary, and then there's a porous boundaries. This is not my own stuff. This is someone else brought that up, so I'm not taking credit for it. But I think that being a therapist, learning to have flexible boundaries, not crossing any lines, but flexible boundaries, that includes what you talked about. And I don't know if you agree with that. You said it wasn't about boundaries. I tend to disagree. I think it is about boundaries because we have to be somewhat flexible.
I agree with you. I like the three. I like the three, but I hadn't heard that before. But I like to think of
Oh,
this
it's
too as
mine
like a
then. If you
flexible.
never heard it, then it's mine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. Flexibility is sort of the name of the game, right? We're trying to adapt how we are based on what the client is really needing and what's going to be most effective for them. And so I think that's part of it. It's part of the healing process.
And I think that I use different language, but I try to keep it as non-swearing here as I can on my podcast. But sometimes people will say stuff and they're like flat about something that's pretty horrendous, and I go, "Wow, that's screwed up." And usually that elicits a strong response.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's okay for us to say that because some people minimize really terrible stuff, especially when you talk about relationship stuff.
Absolutely. And I like to incorporate as much swearing as is comfortable for my clients in session. I'm happy to take that and run with it if I have a client who enjoys that. And similarly with a flat affect, I think there's lots of ways to get in there and sort of reflect that back where, yeah, like what are you feeling as you're telling me that horrifying story with absolutely no visual expression? That's the go-to for me.
There's two signs in my office. One of them says maybe swearing will help. And then I have another sign that says swearing. I call them sentence enhancers.
Oh, I love them both.
So
That's so great.
unfortunately, the episode before yours, I think that is the I always very careful about not swearing. That one I probably swore more times than I can ever recall in like 39 episodes before that. So I'm going to try to make up for that too on this side. But I agree with you. I think, what do you think that swearing helps? You talk about flat affect. Do you think it helps in other ways for clients?
Yeah, like a sentence enhancer. I think that really captures it. I don't know if you're a George Carlin fan or familiar with his work, but what he did for the F word, let's say, I think really he really showed us how many different uses and how it can really, add to what we're saying. There's so much emotion in swear words. And also, I'm not sure if you're familiar, some research was done about when we're experiencing physical pain, right? If we swear, it reduces the physical pain that we experience, which is, I mean, science. You got to love that.
Well, I've heard also that people who swear tend to be more authentic. That's a research. And we must be like distant cousins or something because on my wall it's a take on George Carlin. It's called The Seven Dirty Words in Steve's Office. And the
Mm.
seven dirty words are if, but, try, could, should, would, probably. And that's because they're all
Oh,
conditionals. So I am a
awesome.
George Carlin fan, and I took a little bit of his seven dirty words and put it in my own thing. So
That's great.
I agree 100% about your swearing, and my work with first responders and medical personnel and correctional staff. It's always funny because they'll swear and like, oh, is that okay? I've worked in a jail. I've worked with police, parole, probation, you name it. Yeah, you can swear. I think I can handle it.
That's so great. That's so great, because then people can really be themselves too with you. That authenticity piece, I think that is real.
And I think that that's where I wrote down when you start talking about like, when we have shame, we can't be authentic. So sometimes even using different language, including swears, do you think that can help also lift that shame a little bit too?
I think that possibility certainly exists. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think that sometimes people who don't know me and start with me, they go, that son of, and I'm like, no, you can finish your sentence. I'm fine with that. It's just you're talking here. And because shame also keeps us from saying stuff. So when you
Mhm.
said shame and swearing, it's all in my wheelhouse.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting.
I was going to ask you about you go from going to a therapist to go, maybe this could be my future. I was wondering, did you end up doing that for your senior year, your junior year? Did you end up kind of like going, this feels good? This feels too real? Because sometimes, people go into psychology and then they hear the real stuff behind it. And you're like, oh, crap. I don't know how your experience was.
Yeah, no, I got into it after a semester as an elementary education major and coming to find that that was not my passion project. I quickly got into psychology and I ate it up. I loved it. I particularly liked abnormal psychology. That was probably my favorite. But I ended up pursuing, after a few years in the working world, I ended up going back to get my master's, which is actually when I had my kind of next stint in therapy as a part of my master's program. We had to spend 1 year in weekly psychodynamic psychotherapy. And so I enlisted with a male therapist. I was in my mid 20s, maybe 26, 27. And I think at that point I was really like, help me. I was like dealing with depression. I had a trajectory now. So I was a little bit on firmer ground, but I really needed him to help for me to sort out my life and my psyche. And luckily, I got a great therapist, and it was the best experience to date that I have had in therapy. I would say that the things that worked really well about that are that he sort of held space for me like a champ. Like even when I just needed to come in and cry, he could just be in the room and be like a steady male presence, which I really needed. And he did a lot of pushing me out of my comfort zone, just methodically. Nearly, it felt like nearly every session he was having me do an empty chair, he was having me do meditation, he was having me do guided imagery. At one point he was holding up a pillow and I was punching him, and just all of these things that I think I never would have done. He kind of supported me to get some of my feelings out in these various ways, and that ended up overall working well. I was a pretty resistant client at that time, but it ended up working pretty well. And there even came a point in the therapy with him when I was kind of able to talk about the therapeutic relationship. We had had like a rupture, and I was able to bring it up to him. And
That's impressive.
yeah, I mean, I think for anyone, I'm always so impressed when someone can do that. And when I think about my like little 27-year-old self who was just so struggling, I'm so proud of me that I was able to say that didn't feel good. And it was amazing to me that he was able to respond and he was able to take accountability and he was able to make changes with me going forward. And that far and above, better than any technique he used, totally life changing for me, generating some secure attachment with him. But I'm still to this day really grateful for that particular experience.
I wanted to just quickly explain what a rupture was so that people understand that. Ruptures typically happen in the relationship when a therapist says or doesn't say something. And it might be a lack of empathy, it could be something that was insensitive or interpreted as insensitive. But working through that rupture is very important, and wanted to just explain what that meant. Well, it sounds like he brought you through every single possible thought process of therapy. He did your Rogerian therapy, he did your Gestalt therapy, probably did a little bit of psychoanalytic theory and then a little CBT. It's kind of interesting that he was able to put all that in a year worth of sessions and maintaining a rupture.
Yep. Yep, that's right. He brought it all. He was a really interesting therapist. He and a fellow therapist of his every year, twice a year would take clients who were interested on vision quests. So I ended up doing 2 vision quest experiences with him as well. So in addition to all that you mentioned, we're also doing this kind of like Native American ritual, kind of transition ritual that I got to do with him a few times. So it was packed.
Wait a minute. That is not shown scientifically to work. How would you do that?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like this is a good place for a swear word actually. You know, both yay science and also sometimes, well, science. Because science is not the only not everything is proven by science in this world of healing, and yet so much still works.
Feel free to swear. I didn't say you couldn't swear. I said I couldn't.
Got it.
Like I
Thank you for
said,
clarifying.
I've got to make up for my episode before this one. So that's all.
Got you.
You know, it's interesting because I think that everything you just said made perfect sense because and again, I wish I had my notes in front of me in that way, but a few episodes ago, I said, you know what the most effective therapy is in the world? The therapeutic alliance. Period.
Yeah.
The CBT might be slightly better for mood disorders, but ultimately it's that therapeutic alliance and the therapeutic world that you bring into your therapy. And it sounds like you and him really had that going in the vision quests. I had a vision of you going down to South America and having ayahuasca and doing all that fun stuff. So that's why when you said Native American, I'm like, oh, okay.
Nice. Yeah, no, it wasn't exactly that kind of vision quest, but it was in the desert and Joshua Tree and Mount Shasta out in California, and but really profound experiences. And I agree with you. Yeah,
But
it's the alliance, it's the relationship that heals. That is the consistently proven. Again, if we want to go back to science, we could. That's what works. The relationship is what works to help to change people.
I think that I will paraphrase. I will phrase exactly as you said. Science. My experience, I think that when you think about therapy, we are a medical profession, psychotherapy, private practice, whatever you want to call it this week. I really don't care. But I think that what we tend to forget is that we have a medical privilege to have a very intimate relationship with our clients. And if you don't respect it as an intimate relationship that has a lot of like exchanges, then I think that you're not respecting what therapy does.
I agree with you. I think there's a lot of power in the therapeutic relationship, maybe more so than any other doctor client, doctor patient relationship. Because as you said, there is so much exposure, and we're getting together once a week typically so that we can build a relationship, so we can build trust and safety, and start to make repairs for whatever got lost as a result of whatever trauma happened. So yeah, it's a powerful relationship.
Listening to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, Steve Bisson here, listening to Rachael Chatham talk about, I feel like I have my long lost sister somehow here. I like to quote Kristen Bell to my clients. Kristen Bell had a therapist, and when they talk about how long does it take to get better and all that, and Kristen Bell's therapist once said, you can't expect to walk 5 miles into a forest and get out in two.
Mm,
And
I like
so
it.
I always remind people, like, if you've been fighting this for 20 years, I'm not fixing that in 6 weeks. I'm good. I ain't that good. And most people laugh about that, just like you do. And they're like, it makes sense. But I think that sometimes there is people who come in with expectations of, my insurance says they'll pay for 12 sessions. So you got to fix me in 12 sessions. And even if
Mm,
you don't have that, it's like, okay, I have like $1,500. That's good for 10 sessions. Fix me in 10 sessions. How do we kind of like nicely debunk that craziness?
mm. I love that Kristen Bell is such an advocate for therapy, and that she quotes her therapist pretty regularly as well. I think again, it kind of goes back to that idea of like psychoeducation. I think her quote was a great quote. And, we don't fix a lifetime worth of trauma in 8 quick sessions, but I feel like in the country that we live in, we have grown accustomed to quick fixes and things that we can kind of like get in, get out. And it's rare for me that I have a client that I see for, let's say, 3 months that ends the therapy at 3 months and says, got everything I needed. Perfect. We're good to go. It's rare.
I would have had the book that you have to write if you could do that in 8 sessions. I'm like, I want to buy that book. Put me first thing in line. I will want to get that book.
Wouldn't we all?
Yeah. And I think that that's, when people ask me, well, how come? And I say, well, how long did it take you when you break a bone of any kind on your body? Takes half a second, maybe 2 seconds if it's really painful, but you still have to be in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks. So something that took 2 seconds is going to take 8 weeks to heal. You've been doing this behavior for blank amount of time. Why aren't you giving me at least that blank amount of time to kind of like process it? This is just how it works. No one questions being in a cast for 8 weeks for a broken blank. But
Mm-hmm.
I've been in sessions for 8 weeks. How come I'm not better? Well, it takes 6 months roughly before you start feeling a good.
Yeah.
And it's not 6 months of 3 times a week, but maybe that's what you need. Sometimes it's every other week. But don't expect a lot of change if you haven't worked on it hard enough. And I bring that to my therapy too, because having been in therapy myself, probably since 20, when did I get my license? 27, 28. I've been in therapy since then. And negative outcomes with clients, stuff like that, obviously start to affect you. So I've been in therapy since then, off and on. And I bring my experience in therapy to my clients. And I sometimes even share some of the stuff I've been through just to help kind of like like my clients usually say that makes you human. And I really appreciate that. What have you brought from your experience in therapy into your therapeutic relationship with your clients?
I think I actually bring a lot from my experiences of my own therapy, like anything from kind of the most logistical things, like having been in a what felt like a dirty and cluttered therapy office as a client that kept me kind of preoccupied. I just try and keep a really clean, clear office space so that people can feel comfortable. And they often will comment on that to me. We talked about boundaries, things like communication. I try not to have any distractions in my sessions. I once saw a therapist who, listen, pets are great. I have a cat, love them. Dogs are great. But she had her dog in every session. And she wanted me to engage with her dog at the outset of every session. And I'm coming to her like a people pleaser, a self sacrificer. So, yeah, you want to talk about your dog for 5 to 10 minutes of our session? Okay, like I'll do that. But that's not why I was there. Or, I saw someone whose office was in their home at one time. And I remember their husband walking through the corridors as I'm sitting in the living room with her and just thinking like, oh, I don't feel safe at all here now. So, I mean, just these like very fundamental things, no distractions. I want my clients to know they have my full attention. If a client tells me, if there's a rupture, we could talk about it. I'm always trying to take responsibility, accountability, make changes. If they want it to be more like this, I try and do more of that. And another thing that I will say of my work with my therapist out in California was I'm actually quite comfortable as a therapist pushing people out of their comfort zones because I know that sometimes experiential stuff is just exactly the kind of shift that they need. So I will do a fair amount of that. I try and do it, with empathy and with, we can always stop at any time. But I feel like my experiences as a client have really informed my experiences as a clinician. I don't know if I do use self-disclosure, which I think is kind of what you're alluding to. I try and be really, of course, mindful about it. I try to really kind of choose where I'm going to share and with whom.
Right.
But if there's a moment, funny, I actually was meeting with a client yesterday. We were talking about religion, and I live in the South, of course, in North Carolina, and I ended up letting my client know about my religious background, which is not something that I think she would have ever asked or I would have ever brought up if we were not already talking about religion and how it plays itself out in her practice with what she does. So I do use self disclosure some as well.
and I'm sure you've heard this 100 times, by mind, body, spirit. And I talk about spirituality with my clients. I disclose that I practice Buddhism. I also sometimes disclose that I'm a recovering Catholic. I've finally, I still use Jesus Christ and God once in a while, but I also tell people that I've also reconciliated my relationship with that type of spirituality because I think all spirituality has value. I don't know if I use disclosures as, freely, but sometimes I feel it's important, kind of like relatable for clients, because I think that one of the things that I talk about self disclosure, my clients are that I've had for a long time are always laughing because they say, I know if I ask you how you're doing, you're going to answer honestly. And I'm like, I am asking you for honesty. Therefore, if you tell me how you're doing and I'm not doing good, I'm like, bad. And I think that I use self disclosure as a way to kind of like not tell people my own stuff, but to really kind of like model the behavior.
Authenticity.
Right. Because, recently it was like a relationship didn't work out that I thought was going to work out. And that was like 2 minutes before my client was coming online.
Oof.
So my client comes online. She's like, how are you? I'm like, I really don't know. and
Yeah, fair enough.
I didn't disclose everything, just a weird phone call, but thank you for asking. And we're here about you. And, so I think that I use self disclosure as a way to kind of like be authentic, be myself, but I don't go, oh my God, she left me. You have a 30-minute session for me. So, I think there's a huge difference between the two, but I don't know if you agree or not.
I do. Yeah, of course. I think absolutely. If there's something going on with me, our clients are so perceptive. Again, it kind of goes back to that relationship. If there's something going on with me and I'm not copping to it, they're going to know. So I might as well just cop and say, yeah, my knee is sore today, or my, whatever. I'm tired. I did not get enough sleep last night. So bear with me today, or whatever.
This is
Yeah,
only my
absolutely.
first cup of coffee. I need 3 more before I get in a good mood.
Exactly.
Here's my addiction tendencies, I guess. But yeah, I think that you talk about a lot of good stuff that you bring into your relationship and the therapeutic alliance with your clients. What if there's a budding therapist listening here and saying, "Oh my God, I don't know if I can ever talk about myself, or if I could talk, bring what I learned from my own therapy to a session." What type of advice would you have for them?
I would say get supervision around self disclosure, because I think when used well, it can be really a powerful tool. But when overused, it can be a really detrimental. So, and I think someone starting out is not going to know the sort of, this is a generalization. Not everyone's starting out is going to know the nuance of when might this be appropriate and when might this just be me trying to make them comfortable, or me trying to make me comfortable, or what is there an MO? Is there an ulterior motive to this?
Right. And I think that I have a client who happens to be a social worker who asked me, like, you do self disclosure really well. I said, you never disclose something you haven't resolved.
Yes,
If you haven't resolved it, no one should know about it.
I agree wholeheartedly.
I mean, your therapist should know about it, maybe your friends, but ultimately not your clients. So, when I talk about great supervision, I think that's a great idea. But my clients are like, oh, so when you talk about that, yeah, because if I'm not resolved and I make it about me, what the hell does that say about our relationship?
Well, and it just energetically, you're kind of putting like a blob on the table, and then it's just there. I agree with you. Don't bring it up if it's not resolved.
No, I think that that's my advice, and I wanted to hear yours, and I think yours is absolutely great.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you would say to someone about if you've been in therapy before you become a therapist, a psychotherapist, a social worker? I mean, I'm not trying to discount anyone here.
Sure.
Is there other advice that you would have for them?
Yeah, I think when we think back on our experiences in therapy, I think use that experience. What felt good to you? Did your therapist make you feel safe? Great. What is it that they did that made you feel safe? Did they not make you feel safe? What was that about? I feel like we learn in absentia as much as we learn in a straightforward way of wanting to emulate what someone else did. So I think take that experience and anything from, like I said, what did the office feel like to you? To where was their attention? Another a therapist I saw for a while was a Jungian analyst who wrote during our entire sessions. And I don't know what your style is, Steve. And I think anyone can do, I think people can use different methods in working with folks. But for me, to have someone, I'm there spilling my heart out. She's writing everything I say, not even making eye contact with me. That for me was like awful. That was really bad. So now I don't do that. There's one session where I'm writing and I try to be really clear with my clients. I'm going to be writing. This is not typical. Please bear with me. I'm trying to do a history taking. I'm trying to catch up with you. Otherwise, it's you and me. I'm right here with you the whole time.
Well, my smart ass answer for your therapist who is a Jungian, I said, is this your social mask for you not to deal with me? But anyway, that's my smart ass answer for that.
Totally, totally. What is this persona?
Right. Why are you putting on a persona? And because you ask, and again, I'm trying to be as honest as I possibly can. And frankly, it's my podcast, so I'll do whatever I want. I don't always take notes, but I have found that maybe in the last 3 years, my memory wasn't the same as when I was 27. So sometimes I'll be like, oh, I got to write this down. I'm going to forget. This was good. Because there's days where I wrote nothing and it happens a lot. Like today, I would say that I think I wrote with one client. That's about it, just because there was a good process going on. But I didn't go like my eyes down. You can't see it on here because there's no camera, but I didn't keep my eyes down. I put my eyes up, try to keep eye contact as much as I can. So I think that you can develop whatever style, but most of my clients, and you confirmed it, I had a client of mine who said that that he had a therapist who sat there with his laptop in his lap, and while they were talking,
Oh, dear.
and I'm like, okay, I'm bad because I have to write a few notes. I hope I'm never that bad. And of
Yeah.
course, everyone has their own styles, and that's okay. And I want to be respectful of that. But to me, the therapeutic alliance cannot be that good if your eyes are on the screen or on a piece of paper at all times. So, and again,
Agreed.
it's my podcast, and you seem to agree with me. So, hey, we'll do whatever the hell I want. So, I appreciate all that. And I got to go on the other like curiosity thing because I am so fascinated by other parts that you've talked about. You talked about something about, you like the history of relationship trauma. You talked
Mhm.
about how it was probably your own stuff that brought you there. Can you tell people who don't know what that is a little more about what does that mean? Because I kind of know, but I think that I always want to assume that people may be curious about what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about relational trauma, I just think about the essentially the wounds that occur in our relationships. I think of, I don't know if you're familiar with Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, but that's essentially what we're talking about is complex trauma, the trauma that takes place over time, as opposed to being like an acute trauma, which it sounds like actually you've done a fair amount of work with acute trauma and folks with, first responders and things that, of course, for them, it becomes chronic because they're in that line of work. And now it's one thing after another, after another. But when I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about the clients I work with are doing things now as adults out of habits that got formed when they were really little because their parent was not able to meet their early emotional needs
Right.
for whatever reason, right? So our parents are really well intentioned, and yet there's very few of them who are perfect. I would say zero of them are perfect.
I'm a parent.
So
I'm not perfect, and I'm okay with that. Thank you.
same. I too, my name is Rachel. I'm a parent of three boys, imperfect parent.
Right. Exactly.
So, and yet there are core emotional needs that all kids have. And when those needs don't get met again and again and again and again, it's a trauma. There's neglect there. There can be emotional neglect. There can be physical neglect. Sometimes there's abuse. So there are families that get split up. There's so many things that can happen. Moves can be traumatic. Getting bullied can be traumatic. So many of these things occur in our early lives that that all do constitute over time this kind of like, I want to say like slow drip trauma, as opposed to the whole faucet is on, you know.
I think when I hear you say that, parentification comes to mind immediately.
Yes.
And I think, and then maybe it's a Northeast thing, but I think it's pretty across the board thing. But you know what we used to call latchkey kids.
Yes.
And there's no disparaging remarks here, and I'm not trying to pick on anyone. And if anyone who knows me knows I pick on everyone equally. So I think that that's a little bit of what I heard, complex trauma. I can't wait for the powers that be at APA start recognizing it as a diagnosis. I have a good friend of mine. She was on the show too, and she talks about complex PTSD. And she's like, and I said, look, I hate to be scientific right now, but until we kind of like have it in the books, I believe in it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just can't wait for it to be approved because I think that that's the stuff that I can't wait to see what we can do with that work. But I also have, again, my current notion on March 10th, 2022. This is not the day you're going to hear the podcast, but this is the day we're recording. I don't think that the treatment will be much different than PTSD. It'll be complex, but it won't be as, it's not like we're going to discover like ayahuasca treats complex PTSD significantly better than simple PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
the ayahuasca,
The ayahuasca idea, yeah. I mean, this could be the new thing.
but no, I think that the other thing I tell my first responders is that, some of them are older, some of them are younger. I kind of explained to them, I said, trauma in your job is not the first trauma you see. It's the 27th one that really triggers you. And it's realizing that you can call it complex PTSD. And I'm, again, fine with that. I tell people that trauma is not just like the first one triggers you and everything is from that. Sometimes it's going to be like one of them just triggers everything from your past. And I don't know if you find that that plays a role in relational trauma. I misspoke earlier, so I do apologize for that.
Yeah, no problem. I think just to clarify, I don't know if this makes sense or will answer your question, but I think the impression I get with complex trauma is that it is more about childhood experiences than adulthood experiences. And I think to answer your question, that people who become first responders for a reason. Like people who become therapists for a reason. And
Right.
you're right, when that 27th acute trauma where they're seeing something absolutely horrifying or needing to deal with something horrifying hits, I think there can be a cascade effect of, well, not only was this really intense, but oh my gosh, maybe there's more that ends up coming up from their history as they're exposed to more and more tragedy.
And I will look up that book because I'm very interesting because maybe my own perception, my own, and again, this is not scientific. It's talking about complex trauma. I didn't see a distinction between, maybe you have a happy childhood, everything goes well, you have a happy everything, but then you take on a job that causes significant trauma. And, there's occupational trauma. I think that right now the world is going through complex trauma in general when we go from a pandemic to a war that just makes no sense for a significant amount of people and how that can be triggering from past experiences for particularly the first responders and military personnel. So I think that for me, again, not knowing, and I appreciate the clarification, I always thought that complex trauma can be both, but I could be absolutely
Mm.
wrong.
Yeah, I feel like Pete Walker kind of. I highly recommend the book, and I feel like he dives into it. And honestly, it's been a few years since I read it, so he'll provide a more comprehensive definition. But yeah, I mean, I think we are in a collective trauma with the pandemic and the war. I mean, it's unreal.
Well, again, finding your way through therapy. I'm sitting here with Rachel Chatham. I'm Steve Bissell. It's almost been an hour already. I don't know about you, but it flew by again. It's just great conversation. I have about 12 other questions for you. So I'm going to try to keep it as easy as I can. I will be getting Pete's book because I really want to, read more about that. We talked about trauma therapy. Buddhist psychology. I again, My podcast, I decide what we talk about. As a practicing Buddhist who has found it very helpful to get through a lot of difficulties that have been happening in my life, I didn't even know that existed, Buddhist psychology. So thank you for that. How does that look in therapy? Sorry, I'm just curious. We
No, it's a
pretend no one else is here.
no, it's a good question. And I'll say, I think my understanding when I got my Buddhist psychology certificate, my graduate school was only the second in the country to offer any Buddhist psychology certificate programs or master's programs, second to the school in Colorado, whose name I can't think of right now. But when I was doing my grad school, have my grad school experience, one of my teachers was Buddhist, and she's one of my favorite teachers. I loved her so much. Shout out to Amy Caton out in California. And
I thought you were going to say Pima Shadron. And I'm like, well, no, you
mm,
can't.
love you, Bama. No, it was Amy who sort of really introduced this idea of like, well, if we as her students were really interested, so she ended up creating the certificate program and basically teaching us how can we have this stance within ourselves about the nature of suffering and compassion and the human conditioning, and how can just having that perspective change the way we show up in the therapy room. And so that was a really important thing for me to come to understand. I think it does kind of change the way I show up with my clients. In one way, it shows up is that I teach my clients how to be mindful, how to be more self-aware, how to meditate.
Mhm.
How can we drop our awareness deep, deep inside when we are living here at the surface level all the time, or externally, I should say, externally. So that more than anything else, yeah, I would say that more than anything else is a huge game changer for so many clients. Just becoming aware what's happening in my body as I'm fighting with my partner. Or is there an image of some memory that's actually coming up as I think about this situation with my career? Is this old? Is this familiar? What itches this thing scratching?
And I didn't know what you were going to say, so I didn't want to cloud the answer. One of my clients recently asked me, how do you practice that in your therapy? And I said, because I worked on a crisis team, because I worked with the police, because I've worked with different places, I've learned that the only important person in my life is the person in front of me, because tomorrow is not given, not even the next hour is given. And,
Mhm.
being present in the moment is a very Buddhist principle that I think has helped me just ground myself. So I'm not thinking about, and, knock on wood, this is not happening, but the suicide, the homicide, the overdose, of that happened a day, a week, a month before that. I'm just in front of, right now, the most important person in my life is Rachel, because I'm talking to Rachel, and this is not, it's not about pedestals, it's not about anything else, but you're in front of me. I can't do
Mhm.
anything about my friend in Canada right now. I just can't. But Rachel's here. I'm going to do my best to just be present for her. So that's why I thought you were going to say that about Buddhist psychology, but I didn't want to like.
Ah,
That's how I practice through my work, my spirituality, as well as being therapeutic.
yeah, that's so great. And it's such a great point is that we really only have this present moment. And, we only are with who we're with in that moment. Even these ideals of like impermanence, reminding them, this is an impermanent situation, or how can we bring compassion to this really hard thing, this shame or this guilt or this regret, or so there's so much there that just blends so nicely with the whole therapeutic experience and relationship, teaching people, well, what does it look like if how am I supposed to be compassionate with myself, and then we do that. We take up practices and things to sort of, gosh, bring a little gentleness, bring some internal kindness and some loving compassion in here, not always for the people out there, but actually bring it home. And it's there's so many great tools just in those practices.
And I think about the Eightfold Path as a way, like I have that in my office, I have in my own house. And some clients like, that seems easy. I'm like, all right, tell me how many times you do it in the next week and we'll talk. And I'm like, I think I practice it pretty well. And it's really, really, really hard.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. Simple but not easy, right? Isn't that a very oft used Buddhist sentiment? It's simple but not easy.
right. So, no, I really appreciate that answer. And it's good to know that, we have that in common. The other thing I want to finish on too is you talked about writing. Obviously, we try to segue to that. I know you were, but writing is so helpful for me. I love writing my book. I write every day. Started a book which has like a one phrase prompt, and I got to write a whole page on it, which has been very helpful to me recently in my own life. I journal, and I've journaled off and on since '92. Yes, that tells you my age. Most of you, if you've listened to one episode, you know my age. I've been 29 for 17 years. Thank you very much.
We're pretty close in age then, actually. Are you about 46?
I'm exactly 46.
Okay, I'm 44, so not too far off. Yeah.
So, yeah, so you know exactly what we both look like we are in our 20s, of course. So
Of
that's what I
course.
think.
Yeah. Oh no, of course.
I want to hear more about your writing. And I told you a little bit about how I use it, but I want to know, like, what do you do? Do you write for yourself? Do you write to create for other people? How is your writing influence your life?
Yeah, well, I too I've had a long history of journaling. Over the past, I would say 5 or 6 years, I kind of got back into writing for pleasure. Took a few local writing classes at our community college and then some of our other local writing programs. And I think what I find that I like the most really are things like memoir writing and essay writing and writing about the experience of being a therapist. I think as part of that effort toward normalization, I would like to continue to sort of demystify the experience for people through writing so that they can come to better understand some of these concepts we're talking about, like complex trauma, like how do you do self compassion? What does that actually look like in the therapy room? But to do it in a way that's kind of entertaining, that I get to bring all of my parts forward for, the entertainer part, the part of me that likes being kind of funny. And so yeah, I mean, right now I've written a few things. I've had a few things published like in literary journals. I've published some things on Medium and on Elephant Journal. I like to write about the human condition. The human condition. I mean, if I had to sum it up, that would be my big passion project, is kind of commentating on this human condition and the dynamics that occur in relationships, which fascinate me endlessly.
Well, if you want to personally send me those, I would love to read them. Number one. Number two, if you want me to share it with our audience, I will put the link in our show notes for that too.
Cool. I appreciate that. I think everything that I have published is all linked to on my website, which I will share.
What's your website?
So I actually have two websites. So my private practice website is wholeselftherapy.com. That would be for folks who actually want to work one-on-one with me doing psychotherapy. And then my other website is called The Skillful Self, which I think you could appreciate the name of, coming from that the skillful ways of the Eightfold Path. And on the Skillful Self, I have a few different offerings. I think on my homepage is where I have links to all the writing I've ever done, as well as my other podcast. I'll be adding this one there. And then I have two courses actually online that I created on the Skillful Self. One of them is called the Father Fix, and that one is a 4-week course on healing the father wound. And I use, CBT techniques, I use chemotherapy techniques, I use Buddhist psychology techniques in that one, particularly for people who have struggled in their relationships with their fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other course I have is sort of like a mini course. It's on working with your inner child. And it's called Initiating a Connection and Initiating Connection with the Inner Child. So those are my kind of offerings there.
And what I'll do is it'll be linked in the show notes. So for those who want to go directly, obviously can do that. Anywhere else can you be reached other than your two websites?
No, that's it. And thank you so much for your willingness to put that info in the show notes.
Oh, no problem. And I got to tell you, if it were up to me, we'd be talking another hour about Buddhism. Uh,
Awesome. Yeah, I could
I
do
gotta
that.
I gotta control myself. But if you want to, I'm hoping to have it's not I'm going to be canceled or anything. So hopefully season 5, season 6, I'd love to have you back on, and we can have a longer conversation about that too, as well as I'm going to inform myself more about complex trauma, and because again, therapists are humans and they don't know everything. Just for the record, for everyone.
It's true.
And I'm okay with not knowing everything. I hope I continue not to know everything. But I would love to have you back on. This was Rachel. It's not, sometimes people say that on a whim and they say that for being nice and all that. Truly, Rachel, like I said, I feel like I lost a long lost sister.
Oh, I'm so glad. This was a blast. And I would be happy to come back and talk more about, Buddhist psychology and how we do that in the therapy room. And yeah, keep me posted on where things go here.
It is a fascinating subject that a lot of clients have asked me about. I have people from this audience who have asked me questions, and I think that there would be a lot of people that would be interesting. So, yes, we will
Cool.
definitely do this again.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I'm like, ooh, maybe people could send in their questions and we can sort of answer them together. That would be fun.
I think that we're going to leave it on that because that is an excellent idea. So, please send me information. Obviously, you'll have Rachel's how you can reach her. We'd love to answer questions. I don't know all the answers, as Buddha did not know all the answers either, but we'll do
Nor
our
do I.
best.
Yeah, we'll do our best.
Yeah.
Well, thank
So
you, Steve.
thank you, Rachel. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, this concludes episode 41 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. Rachel Chatham, thank you so much. We had such a great conversation talking about therapy, how it was for you, how it is for your clients, and what we can do. We talked about complex PTSD and looking forward to reading that book by Peter. We talked about Buddhist psychology, which is a great thing. I really, truly was fascinated. I hope when you come back, we will talk about that. We talked about relationship trauma and relational trauma, parentification, shame, and really a lot of good stuff that needed to be addressed. And I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Episode 42 will be with Bethany Amatucci. Bethany, someone I've known for a long time. We have a great story. I hope we get to it at the interview. I don't know if we will or not, but I certainly hope we do. She is a coach and does also, I think, is going to become a yoga instructor if she is not one as of right now. So I hope you join us for the next episode. Please like, subscribe, or follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for information, educational, and entertainment purposes. If you are struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor or therapist for consultation.